The history of Cedar Falls has always been greatly preserved and talked about through celebrations such as Sturgis Falls and historical buildings and museums such as the Ice House Museum. But what about the history and education of Cedar Falls? Well, the Historical Preservation Commission began their third annual History and Architecture event discussing the building and history behind the Cedar Falls schools. The Cedar Falls Historic Preservation Commission held their third annual Architecture and History program this past Tuesday at the Cedar Falls Women's Club. This year, they put together a two-part program focusing on the Cedar Falls education system. The first part was centered on the different architecture and history behind the one-room schoolhouses and the elementary, junior high, and high school buildings. Daryl Anderson, a Cedar Falls architect, and Tom Connors, a historian, led the programs. Connors gave a brief history over each school, such as when it was built, by whom, and how the education in the building has changed over the years.
As was common in new settlements, Cedar Falls' first schools were informal arrangements where local children would gather at the teacher's home for instructions. According to tradition, the town's first private school was held in the log cabin home of Jackson Taylor near what would eventually become Grove and 13th Streets. The site today is now in the park that sits above the utility parkway near Waterloo Road.
After Connor's history lesson, Anderson went over the architectural elements that made up the school buildings. Here he explains the structure of the first school in the city of Cedar Falls.
The schoolhouse was a log cabin with a puncheon floor, clapboards riven out of slabs for a roof, with a mud and stick chimney in one end of the cabin, with an earthen hearth with a fireplace wide enough and deep enough to take in a 4-foot backlog. These details give us a good sense of the first buildings. We also have this photograph of the later 1852 house built around the original cabin. It is simple wood construction of the folk style common at the time. However, the front porch columns show spindlework related to the Victorian era.
Throughout the program, many natives of the Cedar Valley shared their personal stories or insights on the building or history of the schools.
That school year, not one child played games on the computers. They didn't play, they didn't fight, they didn't argue at break time. Anytime they had a minute, they would be lined up. There'd be 26 kids lined up watching the construction.
After touching base on all the educational buildings around the Cedar Falls area, Kathy Craig, a former Cedar Falls teacher and administrator, discussed the rapidly changing education system and how the building structure is important to the education. Kathy concluded the program with talking about the people who have the most significant impact on a child's education.
Research continues to show that the most important factors in a successful school experience are, can you guess what they are? Parents and teachers, you got it. And so, it's time for our community to be making some important decisions about the future of education in Cedar Falls, especially in regards to some of our buildings that drastically need some attention. But we need to be also considering ways that we can keep parents involved and students engaged and teachers empowered to use the very best strategies that they can. And so I hope that you'll stay active in the discussions to come, stay abreast of the information, the issues, so that our schools can truly be educating strong citizens for a promising tomorrow.
The Historical Preservation Commission will be hosting another event Tuesday, January 21st at 7 p.m. at the Cedar Falls Women's Club. This discussion will focus on the history and architecture of how the old Iowa State Teachers College has transformed into the University of Northern Iowa.